All right. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for this opportunity to engage with you all about a topic that's very dear to me. I tried to come up with a title for this that sort of gets at what I think would be an evaluation of Reformed and Lutheran. So we're going to obviously get into the Reformed tradition and have a Lutheran evaluation of that. But my subtitle is Theological Stepchildren. Tried to come up with an analogy that I think gets at both the similarities and the differences between these two traditions. In some ways, they're so close, but in other ways, there's half of the genes that are different. And the further you dig in, the more you see those differences aren't just the surface level things that most people think of. Baptism, Lord's Supper. They go much deeper than that into foundational principles about theology, about humanity, about God, and so forth. So keep that in mind as we go through today. The theological stepchildren, the brotherhood and rivalry of the Reformed and Lutheran tradition. There's a little quote that I think really gets at that from this book, God's Two Words. This is an excellent treatment of law and gospel in Lutheran and Reformed tradition. And in the introduction, Dr. Jonathan Linebaugh writes this. Luther was at Marburg, as we all know, with the famous debates with Reformed and Lutheran theologians. And he writes back home to his wife, Katie, and he says, quote, "We are of one opinion in almost everything, but." And that refrain is something that to keep in mind as well. There, again, a lot of similarities, but there's that big but that the more you dig in, the more that makes a big difference in a lot of areas. So our outline for today, we've got two sessions. First one, I'm going to give a little background of why I'm up here. And then we'll do some historical background and some of the Reformed distinctives. And then the second session, we'll get into some Lutheran misconceptions about the Reformed, major sticking points, historical debates, and contemporary debates between the two groups, and then Lutheran evaluation and Q&A. I probably have too much prepared. I am a teacher by profession, so we'll try to get us through as much as we can. Please feel free to chime in at any point, make this as interactive as possible, and questions and so forth. And if you have some questions you want to give to me between the sessions so I could address them in the second session, feel free to do that as well. So that's sort of the outline for today. So let's get into then personal background. I grew up in a sort of a non-denominational tradition, Baptistic, fundamentalist roots to a certain degree. A very strong background in the Bible and things of that nature. But then when I went to college, I went to Messiah College up in Pennsylvania, and there was certainly a lot of different types of Christianity on campus. And so I sort of started to experiment a little bit and work my way through various traditions. And it's not an overstatement to say that discovering Reformed theology probably changed my life in college. So when I was at college, first I went sort of way off the deep end into charismatic craziness, and then it sort of started to walk back. After a little while in that, you start to see through a lot of that stuff and the manipulation and the misuse of scriptures and all those things. So my roots in sort of fundamentalism to a certain degree, all those scriptures started to come back, and then once I started to work my way back, then I just kept going. And kept reading the scriptures, kept reading church history, and little by little then found my way into the Reformed tradition. Being Baptistic, though, growing up, the big sticklers were baptism and the Lord's Supper. So I would have considered myself a 5-point Calvinist, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But I would not have been Presbyterian, because I still did not agree with infant baptism, nor the more sacramental view of the Lord's Supper. Okay, so then once I was sort of a Reformed Baptist or Calvinistic Baptist, then the next two big things were Lord's Supper and baptism. And through studying especially church history and the use of the oikos formula in the New Testament, essentially household baptisms, that really convinced me of infant baptism. But still, infant baptism and the Lord's Supper, according to Presbyterianism, isn't quite what it is for Lutherans. And those were big hurdles then to cross eventually as well. And all that was taking place sort of between college and beyond, and I enrolled at Reformed Theological Seminary right in Charlotte. That's how I ended up in Charlotte. And while there, I was planning on entering the ministry, Reformed of some sort, Presbyterian or Reformed church. And while there, the more we studied the text of Scripture, the more we studied church history, etc., the more Lutheranism became attractive. And thanks in large part to Pastor Schaff here and Dr. John Bombaro, I became a Lutheran, and I've been here ever since, and it's been great. So I've spent time in both traditions, and hopefully today we can get a better picture of those things. So that's just a little personal background. Just to give you a sense of like how serious this was, my roommate and I in college, who was my best man at my wedding, and now he's a lecturer in New Testament at Cambridge. He's went on to pretty amazing things. He's the editor of this book, God's Two Words. We were so into this, we made a metric of denominations to try to figure out which one we wanted to join. We were both going through the same thing. So we concluded that if we were going to try to be faithful, it was Anglican, Lutheran, or Reformed. And so we created this massive spreadsheet: ecclesiology, soteriology, theology, anthropology, on and on it goes, all the way through. And the instruction at the bottom were to rank 1, 2, or 3. If there's a tie, you give them both a 3 for first. If it's the case of tie for last, you give them both 1. And then you calculate it all out and you see what wins, right? Well, I ended up Lutheran, and he ended up conservative Anglican. So we didn't quite end up in the same exact spot, but just to give you a sense of the level that we were going to on this, we were digging it in pretty deep. So let's get a little definition of terms. There's a lot of cloudiness around these terms: Reformed, Calvinist, etc. So when we talk about Reformed, this can mean a lot of things. There's different senses the word is used. In one sense, it'd be the broadest term for an individual or church that traces their origins to Calvin's Reformation. Okay, 5 solas, right? Scriptura, faith, Christ, grace, glory of God alone. That would be sort of the broadest sense. The 5 solas, Reformed. Reformational might be a loose word to use there as well. And the Reformed love Luther for his monergism, right? The bondage of the will, depravity of mankind, original sin, God's work and salvation, all that stuff. They love him for vocation, freedom of the Christian, etc. They love his critiques of Roman Catholicism and imputation, justification by faith through the imputed righteousness of Christ. But they just don't think he went far enough. They think he was too much still connected to the traditions of the church and the sort of Catholicism that he wasn't able to fully separate from. Right? So they like him a lot, but they don't quite think he went far enough. So that's one sense of Reformed. Then there's the more specific sense of Reformed, like the Reformed Church in America, or the Dutch Reformed Church, or the different denominations that use that term. Okay? And there are several church bodies that use that term, Reformed, in their names. Some of them are listed there. Sometimes as well, Reformed can refer to somebody who holds to Calvinist soteriology, the 5 points of Calvinism. And in many times in popular uses, that's all somebody means when they say, I'm Reformed. It means they believe in what's called tulip, which we'll get to in a minute. Okay? It may not mean anything else. It may not mean they go to one of these Reformed churches. My parents consider themselves Reformed. They go to a non-denominational church. But they believe in a monergistic view of salvation. They like, the Reformation. They like Calvin and Luther, etc. But they're not in a Reformed church. Does that make sense? Okay. What churches were or are Reformed? Puritans and Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Reformed church bodies, Reformed Baptists, some Anglicans and some Evangelicals would be categorized as loosely Reformed. Again, in soteriology. They believe in a monergistic view of salvation, that God does the work, that faith is a gift, that we're fallen, and we can't do anything to save ourselves. Election. Okay, does that make sense? Questions so far on that word and the different senses? Okay, another word, Calvinist. Usually refers to someone who holds to predestination and tulip. It could also be used, depending on the sense, with somebody who is Reformed in the fuller sense of not just soteriology, but all the other things that come along with it. And there's a large group of evangelicals that have moved in this direction. Some have called them the New Calvinists. and some have called them the young, restless, and reformed. This has been going on for a good 10 or 20 years. I remember when I was in college, this was huge. Names like John Piper, a lot of the famous CCM musicians at the time in contemporary Christian music were discovering Calvinism. I don't know if anybody followed all that, but Caedmon's Call was a big band at the time, and Derek Webb, their main leader, became a Calvinist, and it was like a huge deal. And there was this big movement within evangelicalism, returning to these roots of the Reformation when it comes to salvation and God's work. I mean, that was a positive thing. People realizing the problems with evangelicalism, with decision theology, and all those things. Right? And there's still a large group that would be, again, loosely Calvinist in their views of how God works salvation. But that's about as far as it goes. Does that make sense? Okay. And then we've got the term Presbyterian. This would be more specific. This is a denomination that upholds the system of Reformed theology with Presbyterian ecclesiology. Okay. So this would be the most specific of the three terms. And Presbyterianism is basically a church court system that governs local churches. Okay, it's a hierarchical structure to a certain degree. They call it the General Assembly. It's similar to a synodical structure, but with more authority. This is a quote here from a PCA pastor and author, Mark Jones. Presbyterians maintain that the visible church must be governed, not simply advised, beyond just the local particular congregation. So they're not congregationalist in their structure. They have a hierarchy of a presbytery, excuse me. And it functions a lot like a court system. You can be put on trial, essentially, in the Presbyterian denomination if you're a pastor and you're teaching something that isn't in accord with the standards. Okay? So in that sense, it would be confessional. They have confessional documents that they're supposed to uphold, and you can essentially be put in a church trial if you don't uphold those proper teachings.
Is that Westminster?
Westminster. Very good. Yep. Yep. We'll get to that in a minute. Other questions?
What does soteriology actually?
Doctrine of salvation. How does God save us? All right. Good question. So what churches were or are Presbyterian? These are just a few of them. There'd be more. You have the PCA, which is the Presbyterian Church in America, the OPC, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA, and then the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. These would be some of the main ones. There'd be others as well. There's a lot of splintering within the Reformed tradition. Okay? So historical origins. When we think about the Reformed and Presbyterians, obviously they don't go all the way back to the early church. They come mainly out of the Reformation, hence the name. But they certainly connect to the rest of church history by their high view of biblical authority, their practice of infant baptism, their agreement with the ecumenical creeds, and Presbyterians would argue also with their ecclesiology, with their doctrine of the church and the structure of a presbytery. They would find that in Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, etc. That would be their interpretation of those passages. The Reformed also claim historical predecessors and precursors in especially Augustine. They love St. Augustine. The Council of Orange, 529. This was a church council that established monergistic salvation, that God does the work of salvation, and established essentially one-sided predestination. That you're saved because God does the work, not because of something of your own. And that was an ecumenical church council. So they like that. They also like Thomas Aquinas. A lot of Reformed theologians quote Aquinas and his view of the human will, a bound human will, and his view of salvation. And that came up a few months ago with Pastor Ginn with his presentation about Catholicism and some of those connections to Aquinas there. There was also a Roman Catholic group during the Reformation called the Jansenists. They were Roman Catholic, but they were very much in the tradition of Aquinas and this idea of original sin, total depravity, and God doing the work of salvation. Okay, so those would be some connections to pre-Reformation. When we're talking about this, it's good to get an idea of a map. I apologize, this isn't perhaps as large as I was hoping, but this is a map of Reformation-era Europe with predominant religions in each region. In the light green, we see Roman Catholic. Obviously still most widespread at that point. With Lutheran, we see this pinkish color. Calvinist is the purple. And you can see pockets of Calvinism in the mid-1500s here, especially Geneva with Calvin, and then Zurich with Zwingli, the Netherlands with the Dutch reformers, and then we see Scotland with Knox. Okay, those would be some important names: Zwingli, Knox, and Calvin. And Knox actually spent time in Geneva. He was actually a pastor in Geneva for a few years. So he brings Calvin's Reformation to Scotland. Now, by the time we get to the 1600s, what happened to the Calvinistic pockets? What would you say? Did they get bigger or smaller? Yeah, bigger, very much so. Yeah. By the 1600s, these little pockets of Calvinism would be spreading. That's when we start to get more questions about sort of Lutheran and Reformed dialogues. There's some big debates in the late 1500s. For example, with Jacob Andre and Theodore Beza. Beza was a disciple of Calvin. And then we have the back and forth with England between Anglicanism and Puritanism. Puritanism is Reformed. Okay? Puritanism is a Reformed tradition. Okay? And also, it'd just be helpful to get a simplified denominational family tree. This is perhaps oversimplified in some areas, but again, just to give us a visual of the map, where we're looking at, and how this all plays out. You'd have, obviously, the beginning of the church, the big break in 1054, East and West, and then Luther with the beginnings of the Reformation. And then you have all the offshoots out of the Reformation, the radical reformers with Menno Simons and the Mennonites and the Brethren in Christ, etc. Lutheran, and then Reformed and Anglican. These would be the four sort of branches out of the Reformation. And so you can see here the Reformed are going to split several times into different groups, and perhaps some of these are way down the road, right, like Unitarian and so forth. That's a long time coming, but just to give you an idea. Questions so far? Okay, some important confessions of the Reformed tradition. The Continental Reformed on the continent of Europe, they subscribe to what were called the three forms of unity. The Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Canons of Dort. These are all mid-1500s to early 1600s. This was called the three forms of unity. Okay, sort of like a Book of Concord, right? You've got your confessional documents. So that was the Continental Reformed, three forms of unity. And there's really some good stuff, especially in the Heidelberg Catechism. The Canons of Dort. This was part of the three forms of unity. 1619. This was in the Netherlands. And the Dutch Synod there met to deal with the Remonstrants of 1610. So what happened after the Belgic Confession in Holland is there were some divisions about the document and the teachings, especially regarding salvation. And so the Remonstrance is put together by Jacob Arminius. Name ring a bell? What do we get out of that? Arminianism. Which is what? What's Arminianism? Keep you involved
We
here.
complete our salvation.
Right. We do the work of completing our salvation, right? More of a free will view of salvation. Decision-ish. Okay? So the Remonstrance is Arminius. So then the Canons of Dort are a response to the Remonstrance. Okay? And this becomes known as Tulip. The 5 points of Calvinism, which I'll lay out on a future slide. I give you this background, though, because this is something a lot of people don't realize, is that Tulip was created as a response to Arminianism. Okay? It was never intended to be the full system of Reformed theology. But over time, that becomes sort of the moniker, right? That becomes the thing that everybody thinks of about Calvinism, Tulip, which we'll lay out here in a minute. Okay? So that was a response to the Remonstrance, which then perhaps becomes more than it ever was intended to be. And then we get Westminster, probably the most notable of the Reformed confessions. The Westminster Standards, they're called. This was consensus amongst the English and the Scottish reformers, the Puritans and those following John Knox in Scotland. And this would include several documents. I would say if you're going to try to make a parallel, again, it's a bit of a stretch, but this would be the most similar to the Book of Concord. There's a confession, there's a catechism, there's other documents in it, okay, that deal with worship and so forth. Again, not perfect, but just to give you a reference, it's a similar idea. It's a confessional book, okay? They developed a Directory of Public Worship in 1644. They did not like the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. They thought Anglicanism was still too Catholic, so they created their own book of worship. It dealt with the form of church government and laid out Presbyterianism as the structure of the church. And then it had the shorter catechism, Westminster Shorter Catechism, and also a longer catechism. They didn't call it small and large, they called it short and long. And then it had the confession itself, the Westminster Confession, 1646. And that was, again, specifically designed to unite the English and the Scottish reformers and to define themselves over against both Anglicanism and Catholicism. They were trying to thread the needle there between those two groups. Okay? Questions? A few denominational parallels. I mentioned there's a lot of splits within Presbyterianism, and again, this might be oversimplified, but I'm just trying to provide you some connecting points to see similarities. And please stop me at any point. I lived in this world for a while, so if I'm using terms that I need to define, just please ask. So Presbyterianism split a lot. In America, especially around the Civil War era, this was happening in many denominations, right? Splits along north-south lines in the issues related to the Civil War. This might be overly simplistic, but you might think of it as the PCUSA being similar to the ELCA. Okay? Human sexuality issues, female clergy, etc. That's the way the PCUSA went. Okay? Similar to the ELCA. It happened earlier, though, with the PCUSA. The PCA, you might say, is similar to the LCMS. Pretty solid doctrinally, but a pretty big range of practice, right? As far as worship practice, liturgy, etc. Again, that might be too loose of a comparison, but just to try to give you some Lutheran similarities. And then you might say the OPC would be similar to Welsh, perhaps. A bit myopic, a bit insular. Again, it's a loose comparison. Or you might say the OPC is like confessional LCMS churches. That might be a better comparison. If there's going to be a weekly sacrament in the Reformed tradition, which there was for a long time, it's going to be in the OPC. There's a good number of OPCs that have liturgical worship and the sacrament each Sunday. And there's a small group that are trying to recover those historical traditions, even within the Reformed fold. And then some of the Reformed church bodies, the URC and the RCA, are also quite liturgical and sacramental. This would be, like, for example, Michael Horton, well-known Christian author, is part of the URC, the United Reformed Church, or maybe it's the RCA, I can't remember. But he's written several books about liturgy and weekly communion. And actually, when I was Reformed, he's one of the reasons that I started to become Lutheran. Some people call him a closet Lutheran or a crypto-Lutheran, because a lot of his teachings segue nicely into liturgical, sacramental church life. So too with a book by an OPC guy, Darrell Hart. It was called Recovering Mother Kirk, and he looked at the history of the Reformed Church and argued that there is a tradition within the Reformed Church of weekly communion and liturgical worship. Well, he's a reason I'm Lutheran. It's funny, two Reformed authors convinced me more of liturgy and weekly communion. And then obviously there were Lutherans that did that too once I was a Lutheran. But what I'm trying to say is there are some Reformed folks that value liturgy and weekly communion. Does that make sense? And certainly not all of them, and not a majority, but there are some. Okay, so there's a little bit of historical background to try to give you an idea who we're talking about, what we're talking about, what the terms are. Any questions on any of that so far when we're talking about Presbyterian or Reformed or these groups and where they're coming from? Okay, So let's get into some of their distinctives when we talk about theology. One of their big ones would be monergism, the idea that God is the only worker of salvation, right? It's monergistic, one worker. God does all the work. We're passive, God does it. And this is where tulip comes in. This was their mnemonic device in response to Arminius, right, that formed. And it is total depravity. That human nature is totally depraved when it comes to doing anything to please God. That we are by nature sinful and unclean, right? And that we cannot by our own will or power do anything to save ourselves, right? I didn't obviously quote it exactly, but some of that sounds like it's from, the Catechism, right? Then we get unconditional election. That God does our salvation in a way that He doesn't look down the corridor of time and say, oh, Josh, you're going to be a good person, so I'm going to save you. Right? Or, Josh, you're going to decide for Jesus, so I'm going to save you. No, He does the whole thing. He doesn't look down and say, okay, these people are going to be good, these people are bad, I'm going to save these good people. We're all bad. I'm going to save these folks out of this. Okay? Does that make sense? So it's not conditional on something we do. Right? It's unconditional. It's all grace. Then we get to L, limited atonement. Right? One of the sticking points. The most controversial points of the TULIP acronym. This is very controversial, certainly. Some other words that Reformed theologians have used through the years to maybe perhaps get a little bit more clear on what they're meaning is definite atonement or particular atonement. Limited, in our modern context, has some baggage, right? Like we're limiting the work of Jesus on the cross. They would say, no, it's not that. It's that Jesus' work on the cross really accomplishes what it was meant to do. Therefore, it was definite. Right? It definitely is going to save the people it was meant to save. Okay? They would just say that's not everybody. Okay? So it's not limited in the sense of that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do or it doesn't do much. They would say it's more powerful because it actually does what it's supposed to do for the people that it was meant for, which they would call who? The elect. Right. Okay? Now, obviously I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just trying to help you understand what this term limited atonement means. Because this is what happens a lot, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit. We love to create straw mans of each other, right? Especially Reformed and Lutheran. We do it both ways. And living in both worlds, I've seen a lot of that, right? And a lot of times those misconceptions that we use to win the argument, all they do is show the other side that person doesn't know what they're talking about. And that's frustrating on both sides. It's frustrating on both sides. So our first job is to rightly understand what they believe, so then we can engage in a fruitful discussion. And then they can say, oh, this person actually understands my belief. Yeah, let's discuss. They're just, making my argument seem as bad as possible to win the argument. This happens a lot with TULIP and predestination. Right? You make it look as bad as possible so you can bash it and, give your view to win the argument. We can do a little better than that.
So limited atonement, I always explain, it means Christ did not die to save everyone.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
That's accurate. He did not. He died for the elect. What's that?
That's pretty bad.
Oh, indeed. Indeed it is. Right.
They cite a passage, God would save many, or God would save many.
They would look at a lot of the language of chosen in John, especially, that, like, for example, when Jesus says, the ones you have given me, somebody help me with the language here. I didn't.
Given me, I've lost none.
I've lost none. Yeah, there's a lot of language Jesus uses of sort of,
How about
what would be another example?
He came to give his life to ransom for many.
For many.
Matthew.
Right. They would look at, sorry, I should have had some of these passages. That's a good question. Maybe I can probably prepare some for the second session, but they'd look at some passages in Acts too. Like, for example, there's one where, I don't remember what the story is. It might be with Lydia and some others that are saved. And the verse says that, and those who were appointed to eternal life believed. Right? They would look at passages like that and they'd piece them all together and say that this is showing that election, that the atonement was for the elect. Right? They would have problems, obviously, with other passages, like 1 Peter and and so forth, right? Okay? Good questions on the L there. And then irresistible grace. I think a better term that some of the Reformed use is effectual grace. And same idea here. Irresistible grace in our modern use of the word has this idea that there's no resisting, right? That there's nothing one can do to resist. They wouldn't say that... what's the best way to put this? They wouldn't say that people can't resist God. They would say that though the elect, ultimately, God's grace will be effectual in. That eventually, God will get his elect. You may resist for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 80 years, but God will win in the end. That God's grace is effectual. It does what it's supposed to do in the elect. Many people resist God's grace, but the elect ultimately won't. That's what irresistible grace means. So again, I think that's an easy one to characterize a little bit. And again, I'm not saying I agree with these. I'm just trying to help us understand, put the best construction on it, right? Another Lutheran term. Put the best construction on what the belief is, and then we can actually engage in a fruitful discussion, biblical passages, theology, all that. And then we get to the P, perseverance of the saints or preservation of the saints. Again, some theologians use preservation. Perseverance sometimes might give the idea that it's the person doing it, that I'm going to persevere. Preservation is more God doing it, right? It has that context of God's going to preserve his elect. Okay? So that is the TULIP acronym. And this is where a lot of the sticking points are between the Reformed and many church bodies, including Lutheranism. What of these would Lutherans agree with? Or question?
Perseverance is that once saved, always saved thought. In that vein.
Again, yes, that is correct. But again, that's not a Reformed term. That's an evangelical fundamentalist term. The Reformed have a much more robust understanding of preservation and perseverance. It comes from the same origin. But again, I don't think that's what they would say in their confessional documents, or Reformed theologians don't like that term either, because it gives this concept that, okay, I've checked the box, I'm good to go, right? Preservation or perseverance is the idea that you will be preserved in the faith with good works and fruit as evidence of faith, not that you got your get-out-of-jail-free card. Right? So I would not want to fully associate once saved, always saved with Reformed theology. I think that comes more out of evangelicalism as a term.
Would that distinguish Reformed Baptists from
Free will
other
Baptists? Yes, very much so. Yeah. Baptists have a lot of variations that split along these lines. Yeah. You've got particular Baptists. Well, guess what's that related to? Particular atonement, right? Reformed Baptists, those are two groups that split along Baptist lines. Then you've got free will Baptists and other groups. Regular Baptists was another term to show that distinction over Calvinism. Baptists originally were quite reformational. The London Baptist Confession of 1689, when it comes to salvation, is very monergistic. It's Calvinism when it comes to salvation. The other things are different. And over time, they've split and splintered more. Now, as Lutherans, what ones do we have a problem here with? Which ones are the TULIP?
unconditional election?
Unconditional election?
Well,
Describe that a little bit.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the elect, how about that passage that unless the time were shortened, even the elect would, right? Would not be saved.
I think.
I mean, the elect are all saved. But does that mean unconditional? That's the question.
Well, it's unconditional, right? I mean, it's not in view of final faith.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, and I think that's the sense they mean it
Is
here.
that what they mean?
Yes, that it's not conditional on the will of the person
Oh, okay.
or an act of the person. But do you want to?
Well, I think to some extent we have a problem with all
Okay.
points.
splitting hairs to say we disagree with T, total depravity. We just don't. We simply don't use that term.
Right.
And that term can kind of be taken too far.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I've heard said is we would agree with unconditional election to salvation, but not to damnation. One of my professors at Concordia Irvine, Rod Rosenblatt, who was on the White Horse and with
Michael Horton,
Horton
for many years.
He used to say, I like to say that Lutherans are 1.5 point Calvinists, and it makes Michael Horton so mad. He said, if you really want to frustrate your Calvinist friends, tell them that you're 1.5 point Calvinist, because as you just got there, they see this as an unbreakable chain.
Exactly.
If you assent to T, the rest of them have to follow.
Exactly.
Necessarily, logically.
And that gets to one of the big differences, core differences in the two traditions, and that's the role of logic, which we'll get to in the second section. Yes, the Presbyterians and Reformed love to be logically consistent. And there's some inherent beauty in the systems they create because of that intellectually. It's intellectually satisfying, but it's not necessarily scriptural. Right? And that's a big problem. But yes, logically they would see these five as hanging together. So yeah, it's a good point that it's almost, you mentioned that it doesn't really fit with anything we talk about, really. It's a whole different construction of how we talk about these things. But certainly if you're going to engage with discussions with Reformed folks, you need to understand what they mean by tulip and sort of the response we would give to that. So this gets to the idea of the golden chain of salvation. The Puritans especially logically tried to figure this out, right? If God is going to save the elect, how does that happen in time? Right? And they developed this whole chain that, well, this has to happen, and this has to happen, and this has to happen, and all the way through to final salvation. So too with those who aren't saved, right? There'd have to be this whole order of decrees and steps that things play out on in a certain order, which we'll get back to here in a little bit. So monergism would be a distinctive of Reformed theology, and in some senses, the monergism part we'd certainly be right by their side on, right? That God works our salvation, that faith is a gift, right? Ephesians 2, etc. But the specific logically working that out of tulip, Another Reformed distinctive would be covenant theology. To Reformed and Presbyterian folks, covenants are the organizing principle for Scriptures. This is what would be called their hermeneutical principle. Okay? This is the way they interpret everything in the Scriptures, through the lens of covenant. Covenant. And they would see three overarching covenant concepts. The covenant of works, they would say, which was put in place, they would say, with Adam in the garden, right? With the tree. Don't eat of the fruit of the tree. They would say that was essentially a covenant. Now, there was no, covenant ratification ceremony and signing of a document, but basically it was do this and get this, or do this and get that. They would see that as covenantal. Well, that didn't work too well, did it? So there had to be something else. Well, they would see the overarching concept then of the covenant of grace, the promises of eternal life for all those who are in Christ. And they would see the Scriptures working that out, the covenant of grace. They would also peer behind the curtain a little bit, though, and say, well, if God's going to save those who are in Christ, well, then God and Jesus had to make a covenant. Jesus had to agree to come and do this, right? They would call that the covenant of redemption. An eternal agreement within the Godhead to save humanity through the work of Christ. So they would see these covenant ideas throughout all of the Scriptures. And there are tons of covenants in the Scriptures. Right? There's, if you want to call the prohibition of eating the fruit a covenant. There's a covenant with Noah. There's a covenant with Abraham, Moses, David, the new covenant. Right? Covenant is a major theme. And we can certainly gain some insights from using that theme throughout Scripture, right? Tracing it through. But what happens, especially in Reformed theology, is it just swallows everything else up. It even swallows Christ up, I would say. They also would talk about the signs and seals of the covenant. That each of those covenants has an accompanying sign or seal. Right? With the covenant with Noah, we have the rainbow. With Abraham, we have circumcision. Right? With Moses, we've got the Passover, sacrificial system, etc. They would see these connecting points between the covenant agreement and something physical that takes place in the world. And they would say all those culminate in baptism and the Lord's Supper. Yeah.
Each of those covenants requires a blood sacrifice. Okay, even the Adamic covenant.
Right. Yeah.
The Adamic covenant, when God creates clothing for them,
Right.
He does it by killing animals.
Yeah. Good. Okay, so covenant is an important concept. They developed this idea, what they would call covenant theology, as their way to understand the Scriptures. Okay. So they're not dispensational. Again, they're not evangelical when it comes to those things. They would see the overarching approach to use to understand the Scriptures, this idea of covenant. When we talk about end times, eschatology, the Reformed don't have a uniform position on this. You've got amillennialists, you've got postmillennialists, and you've got historic premillennialists. Okay, they're not dispensational. They don't believe in a pre-trib rapture and all that stuff. You've got three traditions of end times belief in the Reformed tradition: amillennialists, postmillennialists, historic premill. And their confessional documents provide a very basic statement about final judgment. None of the elaborate schemes of 7 years here and 7 years there and rapture here and no. It's very basic. They don't. There's no position to subscribe to be reformed when it comes to eschatology. Questions on that?
So what are the Reformed Church's relationship to their confessions? Like what compared, like the OPC, what's its relationship? Is it like a quia subscription to?
So the PCA and the OPC would be pretty solid on subscribing to Westminster.
Yeah.
Yeah. The PCUSA and some of those ones that went liberal in the early 1900s when modernism was coming about and all that, they don't care what you believe. Yeah. But the OPC would be define quia for me. I'm sorry.
Oh, just it.
As it says, or
Yeah, as it says. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not.
As far as it says.
Yeah. Insofar as yeah.
Okay. Yes. Yes. So OPC especially would have a solid position on that. Yeah.
And so, eschatology is essentially an open question within those three categories.
Within those three categories, yes. Certain church bodies might lean a certain way, especially historically speaking. The English Reformed, especially the Puritans, were postmillennials. Some of the more Reformed, like out of Holland and so forth, would have been more amillennial. So it just depends on what part of that tree you're coming off, what you might lean towards. That's a good question. Okay. Another distinctive would be worldview. The Reformed talk a lot about worldview. And by that we mean that Christianity is not just an assent to certain doctrines. It affects all of our view of the world. Right? Sometimes Reformed say a world and life view. Right? That everything you do should somehow relate to your view of the world through Christianity. Okay. There's a quote from Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch Reformed guy, who said, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine." Right? That everything, Christ is Lord of everything. Right? He's Lord of science. He's Lord of math. He's Lord of mechanical operations. Right? Everything. That our worldview should impact how we live in the world. How we consume media, how we analyze media, that everything we do, our Christianity should impact. Does that make sense? And related to this would be their view of apologetics. The Reformed tend to focus on what's called presuppositional apologetics. Okay, that one's presuppositions that they have about the world need to be analyzed. That when you're talking to a secular person, you need to get at what are their assumptions about the world. Because those assumptions about the world impact everything they do, right? Or scientists, right? If a scientist has an assumption that only natural processes explain things, well then that assumption is going to lead them to what? It's going to lead them to naturalistic explanations of everything. And what would it dismiss? It would dismiss things like the resurrection, right? It would dismiss things like creation. So the idea of presuppositions is a helpful tool that when we're talking with folks, you want to get behind sort of the curtain and think through what they're thinking. What are their assumptions about the world that influence things? If my assumption about the world is that, humanity is inherently good, right, then that's going to impact what I think about myself and others and God and so forth. So presuppositions can be helpful. Now, it can be problematic as well. Presuppositional apologetics can become very circular, and that's problematic. And Lutherans, especially out of, say, like a Craig Parton or a John Warwick Montgomery, would focus more on sort of historical approach, right? Evidential approach to apologetics. That God worked in history through Christ, right? Historical, in real time. And then from his death and resurrection, then we can reason out from there to make all those other apologetic arguments. The Reformed say, no, it's your presuppositions about the world. And then from within that system, that should be a logical, coherent system. And their approach is to make the Christian system seem the most logical and coherent and consistent. And they would attack the other views of the world and say, no, those aren't consistent. Right? Now, Lutherans get there eventually, right? But they would say there's a different way to get there. You start with Christ, which is a very common Lutheran theme, a great Lutheran theme.
I think probably more accurate would be to say Lutherans see the value of presuppositional approaches in particular circumstances, but Reformed are more likely to see that as the only valid way to approach the apologetic task. Although that's certainly not a unified Reformed perspective. I mean, there's evidentialists and classical apologists as well within Reformed traditions, but there is definitely a strain within the Reformed, a strong one that would say presuppositional apologetics is the only valid approach.
Yeah. Good, thank you.
When you have the title sovereign, in Kuiper's question is, does the idea of Christ as sovereign come primarily from the Reformed view, or is that coming from evangelicals and working like this, or is it coming down from the Reformed?
Definitely from the Reformed. Sovereignty is massive for the Reformed. That really becomes the central doctrine, sovereignty of God, for a lot of Reformed folks. Yeah.
And so, of course, when the Baptists then kind of borrow that idea and say, have you made Jesus Lord, sovereign of your life, Lord of your life? They're kind of taking that from Calvinism to some extent.
Maybe.
Well, I think the important point for us as Lutherans is, when we say Jesus is Lord of my life, we don't mean ruler. We don't mean ruler. And Calvin means ruler. Right? What do we mean? Savior.
Yeah. Right.
And there's such a huge distinction.
Yeah.
You cannot, if someone comes up, is Jesus Lord of your life, you can't just say yes.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's an opportunity to explain to them the gospel.
Yeah.
That he's the Savior. He has rescued me, delivered me.
Right.
And to take Luther's explanation, second article, is where you fly, right? What does this mean? He has redeemed me, just carry on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good
But
point.
that's Calvin, that's sovereign, of course. 'cause-
Sovereignty of God, would
Yeah,
be huge
yeah.
there out of that. But very good, yep. Another distinctive, now some distinctives in practice. Some Reformed believe in what's called the regulative principle. This is related to worship. That practices in worship should be based on the Scriptures. Now, again, not all Reformed groups believe this, but it was part of the Westminster Standards, the regulative principle. That if we're going to do something in worship, it should be in the Bible. If a worship practice is not in the Bible, it is prohibited. In other words, scriptural silence on a worship practice means prohibition of the practice. Okay? So if it's not in the Bible, if there's a silence on a certain issue, then we shouldn't do it in worship. Right? Now that's very different than saying if it's forbidden, we won't do it in worship. Right? It's a much stricter view. That if something's not evidenced in Scripture as a worship practice, we're not going to do it. Now, if you go to the PCA church down the street, well, you'll see a bunch of things that aren't in the Scriptures, right? But so this would be certain strains of Reformed theology or Reformed tradition, especially the OPC, okay, or even some subsets within the OPC. This can lead to all sorts of weird places if you take it very literally. Anybody familiar with some Reformed groups that take this to the extreme, where they cut out a bunch of things in worship?
Oh, you mean,
No music.
like no organ?
No, not even any music at all. No musical instruments. A cappella worship. Or singing psalter only. There's several Reformed bodies that are psalter only. And what does that mean? Well, that means they only sing psalms from the Bible. Right? So some groups take this very extreme. Others, not so much.
Are there any that don't commune women?
Don't commune
Don't
with.
commune women?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know.
I mean, the regular principle, can sort of be abused that way, couldn't it? I mean, we don't see an explicit instance.
Oh, I see what
of
you're saying.
commune in the Bible.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody takes it that far, but yeah, it's a good example of how this can be quite problematic, yeah. Another distinctive in practice would be iconoclasm. The Reformed have no room for images of Christ or much artwork at all. Classic example here would be the Puritan churches, completely white-walled, white paint everywhere. The only piece of church architecture in the building, besides pews, would be what? You had to climb the steps to get way up high. Pulpit. Massive pulpit. Right? Massive pulpit. That was really the only piece of prominent church architecture in Puritan churches. So no room for artwork. This is because of how they interpret what we would call the first commandment and what Reformed and other Protestants would call the first and second commandment. They number the commandments differently than we do. Okay? They break the first commandment into two. Okay? And they would see the second commandment forbidding idolatry. And they would take that as any graven image, right? So they take that very literally as no images. Here's a quote from the Second Helvetic Confession of 1561. Since God as Spirit is in essence invisible and immense, He cannot really be expressed by any art or image. For this reason, we have no fear pronouncing with Scripture that images of God are mere lies. Therefore, we reject not only the idols of the Gentiles, but also the images of Christians. Although Christ assumed human nature, yet He did not on that account assume it in order to provide a model for carvers and painters. So that would be their view of images. None. No church artwork, no crucifixes, no images of Jesus. Now that would be folks who are consistent in their holding of this. Okay, I've got like 2 more slides for this first session, if that's okay, and then we'll break just where I was hoping. I'm surprised. I thought we wouldn't get this far. So a few Reformed theologians that are pretty solid. This is my top 10 list. Now, summarizing a whole tradition in 10 names is pretty difficult, but here's my 10. Calvin, one you recognize. William Ames, a famous Puritan. Jonathan Edwards, famous for Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God, but if you actually read his theology, it's pretty awesome. He doesn't talk about that type of thing all that much, but anyway. B.B. Warfield, famous Princeton professor, especially good on the inspiration of the Scriptures. when modernism was coming about in the early 1900s and a lot of people were questioning, higher criticism was growing. Warfield and Hodge at Princeton were huge voices in upholding the inerrancy of the Scriptures. So Hodge and Warfield were the Princeton theologians. Then you got J. Gresham Machen. He wrote a famous book, Christianity and Liberalism, in the mid-1900s. Cornelius Van Til with all the apologetic stuff. M.G. Klein, R.C. Sproul, and Michael Horton. If I were going to recommend a few, it'd be Horton, Klein, and Machen. They're pretty solid. Other groups that are reformational in sort of our modern society, the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals and the Gospel Coalition. These are two pretty solid groups that are worth respecting, we'll put it that way. The ACE and TGC put out some pretty solid stuff. Again, we wouldn't agree with all of it. But again, if we're going to engage in fruitful dialogue, those are some starting points, perhaps. And then perhaps this is a good stopping point. We'll get to misconceptions there after lunch. Does that work? Okay. Any questions before lunch?
What, at the beginning when you were talking about you and your roommate, what
Yeah.
confession did he adopt?
He's conservative Anglican, so he'd be Book of Common Prayer and the something, I can't remember what year it was.
So was there one determining factor between you and him, or what?
Yeah, he had a harder time giving up on some of those logical consistencies, and with Anglicanism, there's a lot of room for different, beliefs.
Okay.
So he was able to hold on to some of that sort of logical consistency about election and assurance, and embrace a sacramental and liturgical life. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Any other questions before lunch?
I don't know if you can address this in 60 seconds or not. I've seen R.C. Sproul's name thrown about in a ton of different contexts. Like, it seems like there are a lot of different strains of Reformed and evangelical theology that like to grab hold of him.
Yeah.
How would you summarize his basic position to the extent that
I would say he was a major popularizer of Reformed theology in the last several decades. He was one of the major forces that drove that whole move within some evangelicals to embrace Calvinism and Reformed theology. He was Presbyterian, denominationally. I can't remember what church body he was a part of. R.C. Sproul. But yeah, I have to do a little more research to go beyond that. But good question. Other questions?